Good morning and welcome to those of you who have just filtered in. So welcome back to our evaluation support for attainment raising series. This is the third in a kind of three-part series that we've been running over the autumn term. So we've done a session on developing theories of change, and then also on thinking about formulating research questions and how to identify outcome measures. And we're now back for our third and final session on choosing an evaluation methodology. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Sarah Connor, who's on screen here, and we'll be talking you through the different types of evaluation methodology that can be used and useful for evaluating attainment raising initiatives or interventions. But before I do that, just some basic housekeeping. You will have noticed that you've joined the webinar format on Zoom, so you'll be automatically muted and your camera's off. That's okay, that's the way it's intended to be, but hopefully you can see and hear us okay. And then you'll also notice at the bottom of the screen or somewhere on your screen, a little Q&A chat function. This is so that you can write questions throughout the session today, anything that you want to probe on or want us to elaborate on, and we'll mop those up at the end of the session. So we will reserve a full kind of 10 to 15 minutes to try and get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar this morning. I think we can probably go ahead and kick off. There are still a few people filtering in. So Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rain, and good morning, everyone. My doorbell has literally just rung and my dog has started barking. So apologies if you can see that. Nice start to the webinar, but better to happen now than halfway through. Thanks everyone for joining. Just to sort of run through what we'll be covering for the next hour. So just do a really brief recap on what's been covered on those other webinars as part of the series that Rain mentioned, and then going to do an introduction to different types of evaluation. So we want you to leave here with sort of a good overview of the different evaluation methodologies you can use and also their strengths and weaknesses. I'll then do some signposting to some of our resources that can help you in developing evaluation methodologies, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end, as Rain said. So feel free to post questions into that Q&A function throughout. Don't feel like you need to wait till the end, but obviously we'll address them at the end in the last sort of 15 minutes or so. So to start with, I'm just going to do a very brief recap, as I said. So this is our third webinar in the series. So to start with, Rain talked through how to develop a theory of change and went through an example theory of change for attainment raising intervention, which was a Key Stage 3 literacy program. So I'm going to be coming back to that example today. And then last time, Nicolette talked you through developing research questions and selecting different outcome measures, again, using that sort of Key Stage 3 literacy program example. So if you are just joining today and you haven't been to those previous webinars, we will be emailing out a recording, so you'll have access to those previous two webinars that you can watch before this. So don't worry too much if you haven't been to all three. But if you have been to all three, welcome back. So a recap on what Nicolette went through last time. So she talked through developing research questions. So talked through the importance of a primary research questions to really interrogate the main impact of your intervention. So in the example that she went through, the main research question was whether the literacy program increased in attainment in English at Key Stage 3 among students. But she also talked through some secondary research questions. So these inform your primary research questions, but are sort of less important, and you can have multiple secondary research questions. So in this case, it was whether the programme also improved academic self-efficacy and also engagement with academic studies. So these are likely to be measured earlier and inform your main impact, but aren't sort of the primary aim of your intervention. She also took you through selecting different outcome measures and indicators. So which outcome measures you use for the sort of primary outcome and secondary outcomes that you're looking to measure. So the primary outcome was that improved attainment in English. So the outcome measure you'd want to use here would be an English test, and an indicator of success would be the number of students attaining improved English grades. and you'd get this from administrative data sets. But if you're looking at increased academic self-efficacy, the outcome measure here would be from our Access and Success questionnaire, the ASQ, where we've got a validated scale for academic self-efficacy. So this would be a survey measure, and again, it could be the number of students reporting an increase in academic self-efficacy. So that's a really brief sort of recap of where we got to in the last session and sort of where we'll be going here. So to start with, going to focus on choosing an evaluation methodology. And just a reminder of where we are in our evaluation cycle. So we started in that diagnose phase with Rain's webinar to start with, which was on establishing a theory of change for your intervention, which is a really important starting point. We then moved on to the plan phase. And this was identifying research questions and identifying outcome measures that Nicolette covered last time. So we're going to remain in this plan phase to start today, which is selecting the research methods. And we are using evaluation methodology and research methods sort of interchangeably here today, talking about methodology. And the next through on the cycle, you'd look at actually collecting that data, measuring impact, but we'll be remaining in the plan stage today. And there's different types of evaluation, which I really wanted to highlight to start with. You'll have an impact evaluation, which will tell you whether the intervention works or if it doesn't work. But this should be done sort of alongside an implementation and process evaluation, an IPE. So these go hand in hand. The impact evaluation will tell you whether the intervention works, but the implementation and process evaluation allows you to sort of interrogate how and why that intervention does or doesn't work. So it's important that they go hand in hand and that they're used concurrently, but we will be focusing on impact evaluation methodologies today. But just to highlight that we are in the process of developing resources for implementation and process evaluation as well, which is really important to do alongside any impact evaluation. So I'm going to go through types of evidence, and this is based on the Office for Students types of evidence. So a lot of you may be familiar with this. It's referenced a lot in sort of access and participation plan guidance and guidance from the Office for Students. So we have our type 1 type evidence, which is narrative. So this is based on having a really coherent theory of change for why we think our intervention will work. And pleased to say we've got a lot of this in the HE sector currently. A lot more people have that sort of narrative for why they think their intervention will work. The next stage along is our type 2 evidence, and this shows whether an intervention is associated with better outcomes. And we're getting better at developing type 2 evidence, which is sort of the next stage along and is more robust than our type 1 evidence. But what we really want to get to is our type 3 evidence. So this shows whether an intervention actually causes the outcomes that we're seeking to measure or that we want to achieve. And we're lacking in this. There is a greater understanding of this type of evidence, but we're still lacking in this sort of causal impact evidence for different interventions. So I'll go through these in a little bit more detail now. So type 1, as I said, the description here is just that it's a coherent theory of change. So why you think an intervention will lead to the change you want. So why you think this Key Stage 3 literacy programme will increase attainment in English. The evidence here is generally elsewhere. So you've got evidence elsewhere that this type of intervention has been impactful. So it might be in published literature, it might be anecdotally from your internal institution, or it could be from other institutions. And the claims you can make here, you have an explanation of why you're delivering a certain intervention and why you think it will work. And this is what Rain covered in our very first webinar. So this is what the TASO core theory of change looks like. And this is our completed theory of change for our Key Stage 3 literacy programme. So here it gives a nice overview of why we think this intervention will lead to increased engagement with academic studies, increased academic self-efficacy, and then ultimately improved attainment in English at Key Stage 3. And there's different strengths and limitations of this. So the obvious limitation is that it's just a theory at this stage, and it obviously is based on existing evidence on the whole, but you're not actually collecting data on the impact of your intervention at this stage. So you can't make any claims on whether it does actually work. You're just theorizing how you think it will work. So there's some strength there, and that it tends to be based in existing evidence. But the obvious limitations is that you don't know whether it works because you're not collecting data at this stage, which is why we want to move on to type 2 evidence, which is empirical inquiry. So here you might be collecting quantitative or qualitative evidence. You might be using a pre-post design, which we'll go through in a little moment, to show that those receiving an intervention, those that involved in an intervention, have better outcomes. So that intervention is associated with better outcomes. But it's important to note here that we don't have any causal impact evidence here. So we don't know for definite that it's that intervention which has caused those outcomes. We just know that it's associated with better outcomes. So you can move towards making more robust claims, so more stronger claims about an intervention. And at this point, we can say that an intervention is associated with better outcomes or perhaps poorer outcomes. But you might also see this as correlational evidence. So you're showing a correlation between an intervention outcomes or a relationship between an intervention and outcomes. So those sort of terms are used interchangeably there. And an example of type 2 methodology is our pre-post testing. So as an example, just have a think in your head how you're currently feeling. Obviously, you're at a TASO webinar, so I'm expecting you to be, on the 5 to 7 scale anyway. But, it is raining and it's cold, so you might be slightly further down. I'm then going to present you with a really important intervention. And now I'd like you to, again, think about how you feel. I mean, obviously, depending on whether you like puppies or not, this could impact how you're feeling. But I'm certainly further up the scale now after seeing that very, very cute puppy. So that's a really simple example of sort of pre-post testing. So you measure outcomes in your population at the start. You then put them through an intervention, or they take part in an intervention, and then you measure the same outcomes at the end. And you're then comparing the results from before the intervention and after the intervention to see if there's been an improvement in outcomes. So let's go back to our Key Stage 3 literacy programme. So this is what was used in the example that Rain and Nicolette went through in our previous webinars. But just as a little recap, we have our literacy programme, and this consists of 12 sessions for 1 hour per week. And they're group-based tutoring sessions in literacy and in reading. And they're delivered by current students, so student ambassadors at a higher education provider. And it's a 12-week programme that runs sort of in the spring term. So you would administer an English test to participants before they start on the programme. So in January, they would then attend this 12-week literacy programme, and then you do another English test in April, and you're trying to see if there's been an improvement in those English test scores between January and April. And if we look at our outcome measure, our English test, we can see that the mean, the average score in English testing was 58 before the intervention took place, so in January. And then when we tested in April after the intervention, we can see that our average is 73. So there's been quite an increase in English test scores, and we can also look at our effect size. So effect sizes sort of tell you across different measures, so you can do comparisons across different measures, generally what the impact of the intervention is. So a small effect size is considered to be 0.2, a medium effect size is considered to be 0.5, and a large effect size is considered to be 0.8. So we've got 0.58 here. So in theory, we've had a medium impact through this literacy program. And these results have come from something called a paired t-test. And we do have guidance on our website on how to conduct this using Excel. So I would recommend looking at that resource if you'd like to conduct this sort of test. It really gives like a breakdown of how to conduct it. So if we're looking on the face of it here, we can say that our Key Stage 3 literacy program has improved our English test scores. But the problem here is that what else might have happened across that 12-week period? How do we know for sure that it was the literacy intervention that improved those English test scores? So what else might have been going on? It's January to April. It's leading up to sort of the summer and exam season. So perhaps these pupils, these students would have improved in English naturally during that time anyway, even without that intervention. Or perhaps they got more parental support, more family support in that time because parents felt they needed to give their pupils more, their children more support leading up to that exam period. So there could have been a number of things that could have happened in that time. So the problem with this pre-post testing is that we don't know for sure that it's that intervention that's caused the improvement in scores, which comes to our sort of strengths and limitations. So that obvious limitation there, it assumes that if the intervention didn't happen, then those English test scores wouldn't change. So it doesn't consider any other possible drivers of change or the fact that the change could have occurred naturally over time anyway. And that's because you're not comparing to other groups. So you don't have a comparison to pupils that didn't take part in the intervention, for example. But the strengths are that it can be really straightforward to implement, as I've said. So you can do it with survey data or, like in that example, with a test that's taken before and after, which means it can be really easy to interpret the change over time. So it's a nice, easy way to get that type 2 evidence on your intervention. But it's also worth flagging that you can only use outcome measures that can be collected at multiple time points. So it works for like a class English test, for example, but it's not going to work well for GCSEs because you take that once at one time point. You wouldn't take that before and after, or something like enrollment into higher education. That's going to happen at one time point. So you can't use it before or after. But things like survey data, so measuring academic self-efficacy, that is something you could measure before and after an intervention. So there's sort of the way to improve that then and get over that limitation is to introduce a basic comparison group. So you have your pupils at the top that take part in intervention, and you're measuring their outcomes before and after the intervention. And then you have a comparison group that don't take part in the intervention. And you can again measure outcomes at the end and compare outcomes with the group that participated and a group that didn't. So going back to our Key Stage 3 literacy program, we have a group of pupils on the left that attended the program. So they went on this 12-week tutoring sort of program. And we have our group on the right that didn't attend the program. And then if we compare outcomes at the end, we can see that the average English test score for those that attended the program is 75%, so quite good scores. And for those that didn't attend the program, it's lower at 55%. So again, on the face of it, we can see that those that attended the program seem to have better outcomes. So we can say that our programme hopefully has worked in improving English test scores, because we've got higher English marks in those that attended compared to those that didn't. But again, we come up with some problems when we then compare the groups. So what differences might exist between the group of pupils that attended versus the group of pupils that didn't? So there might be some obvious observable demographic differences. So for instance, maybe in the pupils that attended, there were a lot more females. Females tend to have higher attainment. So here, if there's more females in our group that attended, that could explain why there's higher attainment in that group rather than the actual intervention. The group that attended as well might have had higher prior attainment going into the tutoring as well. And we also might have had more free school meal students that tend to have lower attainment in our group that didn't attend the tutoring. So there might actually be key demographic differences which accounted for the effect, the improvement in English scores rather than the actual intervention. So those are some obvious differences. But what about other unobservable differences that we can't measure? So for instance, for those that attended the tutoring program, they might have opted into the program, which means they're likely going to have higher motivation already. They really want to improve their English. That's why they're going to their English test scores, which is why they're going to the tutoring. So they're likely going to have higher motivation, which could impact on the scores. Or maybe they've got more parental or family support at home than the groups that didn't. So this is why we have to be really careful, even when using a comparison group, because both observable or unobservable differences in those groups may mean that we end up either over or perhaps underestimating the effect of an intervention. So some obvious strengths and weaknesses there. So the strength is that, again, you can kind of use your existing data, your existing group of pupils that didn't attend, and compare that. So it can be reasonably easy to create that comparison group. And the strength is that you have your type 2 evidence, so you're showing a correlation between your intervention and the outcomes that you want to see. But those limitations are that you could be comparing really, really different groups of pupils. So you could be comparing apples with oranges. And because of that, it's difficult to make strong claims about impact. So you can only show that sort of association. You still don't know for definite that it was the intervention that caused the improvement in outcomes. Which moves us on to type 3. So type 3 evidence is the type of evidence which can show the causal effect of an intervention. And that's because you're using an appropriate control or comparison group. So both type 2 and type 3 might be using a comparator group, but the key to type 3 is the type of control or comparison group that you're actually using. And because it's an appropriate control or comparison group, it means that you can make those robust claims and you can show that it was the intervention that caused the increase in outcomes. So we really need type 3 evidence. So correlation doesn't mean causation. So this example here, just because your sales increased when you have more staff that have shaved heads, it doesn't mean everyone should be going around shaving their heads, because this is just an association. It's just a relationship, and it's not showing for definite that shaved heads cause better sales. So we really, really need that type 3 evidence to actually uncover the fuller picture. But type 2 evidence is a good start and obviously a good improvement from type 1 evidence. So if we're going back to our literacy program example, we've got a pool of eligible students who are able to attend. This might be based on their current test scores in English. So you're targeting students who are below perhaps a certain threshold in an English test, and they're able to take part in the literacy program. And the way that we can improve the comparison group, the best way to create this type 3 evidence is through randomization, so a randomized controlled trial. So that means from our group of eligible pupils, we're randomly allocating them to either attend the literacy program or to not attend. So in its simplest form, randomization means that each pupil that you've got in front of you, you could toss a coin. If it lands on heads, it means they get a place on the literacy program. And if it lands on tails, it means that they don't. So it's completely decided by random. You're not picking based on characteristics or anything else. And because of that, because of the law of numbers and how randomization works, it means that your characteristics even out across the groups. So let's say our blue students in this example are female. You can see we have 2 females in the treatment group and 2 females in the control group. So because of the way randomization works, it means that these groups are going to be roughly similar on observable characteristics. So you're going to have the same amount of males, females, free school meal students, the same prior attainment balanced across those 2 groups, but also unobservable characteristics. So things like motivation, family support, parental support is going to balance out across those 2 groups as well. So it then means when you're looking at the outcomes across the 2 groups, it's actually a valid estimate of the program. You know that it's the program that's caused those outcomes. You can make a more robust claim there. So if we go back to our literacy program example, if our treatment group, so those that were randomly allocated to receive a place, get the average English test score is 75%, and then the control group, those who were randomly allocated not to attend the program, got 55% as an average English test score. We can then attribute that improvement or better English test scores to the actual literacy program, because we know there's not key differences between the groups or and anything else that could explain an improvement in English test scores is going to have been balanced out across that treatment and control. So that's the beauty of randomization. And randomization can happen at different levels. So in the example I've used, a relatively simple example of individual pupils. So you're randomly deciding whether one pupil gets a place or one pupil doesn't. So it's really at that individual level. But something that's really useful in the attainment raising space and working with schools is that you can also randomize at the group level. So for example, you can randomize at the classroom level or a particular teacher level. So here you'd still measure English test scores in those individual pupils that make up a classroom, but you're randomizing the whole class. So for instance, if you have 8 different English classes within a school, rather than tossing a coin for an individual, you're tossing a coin for that class. So a class, you have a class in front of you, you're tossing a coin, heads, that whole class receives that additional tutoring, or tails, it means that whole class doesn't receive it. So you're then comparing outcomes in individuals, but across classes, rather than just looking at individuals. And you can go even further than this. So you can randomize schools. So certain schools that you work with might be randomly allocated to receive an intervention. So the whole school does, whereas a school in the control group doesn't. And you can go even further than this. You can look at districts. So perhaps the Southeast have been randomly allocated to receive an intervention. So all the schools in the Southeast receive that intervention, whereas those in the Northeast don't. And you can go even further and look at countries. So all the schools in Canada receive an intervention, and all the schools in Russia do not. And you can go even further and look at planets. So everyone on Earth receives an intervention, everyone on Saturn, testing my planet knowledge here, doesn't. Or you can go even further and look at galaxies. I don't actually know the names of galaxies, but our galaxy receives an intervention, but another doesn't. You get the idea. You can go up and up and up. But being serious now, coming back to it. So individual level randomization is ideal. that's really what you want to do, because not to get too technical, but this gives you the most statistical power. So this means that you're more likely to actually detect a true difference between a treatment group and a control group, if it is indeed there. But group level randomization, so randomizing at the classroom level or at a particular teacher level, can really help, and is a good thing to do if you think there will be spillover effects. So for example, let's say you have a class of 20 and 10 students in that class were randomly allocated to receive additional tutoring. It could be quite likely that those that receive additional tutoring are then sitting in class most days or every day with other pupils that didn't receive the intervention, and they're actually helping out their classmates, or they're applying what they've learned in their literacy program to their English class. So there can be spillover effects. So even pupils that didn't attend the intervention could get some benefits from the intervention just by being around other people in their class that have received it. So in this case, it's easier just to randomize at that classroom level, because it means you're sort of controlling for those spillover effects. But you do need a much larger sample size for this. So this is called cluster randomization, and you need a lot more clusters. So you need a lot more classes than individuals. So than if you're randomizing by individuals. So that is the caveat there. If you're going to do that, you need a larger sample size. So our randomized controlled trial are RCTs. So some really key strengths is that it provides evidence of causal effects. So you can actually make claims that it was the intervention that caused those outcomes. And this is really helpful then in determining whether an intervention or a policy works, and therefore whether you should roll it out or increase it, perhaps in the schools that you're working with. And because randomized controlled trials are controlled and randomized and everything's balanced, they have high internal validity, so you can be confident in those results. But there's some obvious limitations as well. It can be quite time consuming, expensive and difficult to randomize. So if you're working with a lot of different providers or different schools, it can be difficult. There's lots of things to consider when randomizing, and you do need a really large sample, because if you have a small sample, characteristics aren't going to balance out as well across treatment and control groups. So you do need that large sample in order to be able to run a randomized controlled trial. And quite often you need sort of an oversubscription, or more pupils that want to attend an intervention, for example, maybe than the number of places available. So then you can decide those places by randomization. So you need quite a large sample for that. So this brings us on to quasi-experimental designs. So these are still a type 3 methodology, but they have a naturally occurring control group or comparator group, generally from existing data. So they're trying to simulate a randomized controlled trial using data that you've already got. But it's different to that sort of basic comparison group that I talked about earlier, because your matching method is strong. So the way you're matching students that receive an intervention to your comparator group is really important. So you need them to be really similar in characteristics so that you can still understand whether and make causal claims about an intervention. So I'll touch briefly on sort of some matching methods. So there's something called propensity score matching, or PSM, and this is where you'll match an individual, so an individual pupil, or perhaps a whole class, if we're talking about class level, with another individual or another class based on their characteristics. So let's say those in greeny, sort of turquoise sort of colour are those that receive the intervention. And those in that sort of pinky reddy colour are those that you want to match them with who didn't receive the intervention. So these pupils will receive a score, so in that sort of statistical matching process, and you want to aim to match students who have a very similar score. So that means that they're the same age, they're both female, they both have the same prior attainment, they're both in receipt of free school meals. So you're really just trying to match them on every characteristic. They're in the same English class, or they're in the same school, or the same set of English, or something like that as well. So you really want to make sure you're matching on as many characteristics as possible, and that those characteristics are important and actually related to the outcome. So we know that gender and prior attainment can impact attainment. So those are good characteristics that you want to try and match with. So you're trying to engineer a control group based on having similar characteristics. And propensity score matching is often used in something called a difference in differences methodology, which I'll briefly run through now. So let's take our literacy program. So our green turquoise sort of line represents the trajectory of English marks before the intervention and after the intervention, and that grey line there represents when the intervention came in, which was this literacy program. And if we're looking at this alone, we can see that those that received the additional tutoring had increased English marks. So we can see that the line sort of increasing to show that there's higher grades in English post intervention. So if we're looking at that alone, we can think, oh great, that's worked really well. But again, the issue is that we don't have a comparison group. So then let's introduce a comparator group. So we've got outcome data for those for post intervention. So for after the literacy program was introduced. So the line in green, we have those that received additional tutoring, and those in pink just received usual teaching. So they can be our comparator group. But the problem, if you're just looking at post intervention, is that we don't know the trajectory before the intervention was brought in. So maybe those in the additional tutoring groups were already on that trajectory. So their English marks were already going steadily up compared to our comparator group. So that means that we need to collect pre-intervention data as well, which is demonstrated here. So we can see before the intervention, we've got nice parallel lines in these groups. They were both on similar trajectories, though our treatment group students were on the whole receiving higher English marks. And we see when we brought in the intervention, this went even further up. So we can see that dotted line was where we would imagine their English marks to be if the intervention wasn't introduced. So we can see the additional impact of the intervention. So you can do this because you've got that pre-intervention data, so we can look at what their attainment was in both groups before the intervention took place. And then we can compare groups. So we can compare our treatment group who actually received the additional tutoring compared to our comparator group who just received the usual teaching. So you really need that good pre-intervention data to be able to do this and sort of track the trends prior to your intervention coming in. But other methods to use if you don't have that pre-intervention data, another sort of quasi-experimental design is a regression discontinuity design. So this is really useful when you've got a clear threshold or a clear cutoff for those receiving an intervention. So for example, you want to offer tutoring only to those who get 60% or less on their English test. So those scoring below 60 or 60 receive that additional tutoring, whereas those above 60 don't. So that means our treatment group effectively is on our left-hand side here, so those receiving less than 60 in their English test, and our comparator group is those on the right. But a key caveat when using the design is that you can only compare pupils who are really close to this threshold. So perhaps students who received 55 to 60, and you're comparing it with students that received 61 to 65. So that's because you're assuming that our pupils round the threshold are similar in characteristics because they've got similar marks on that test. So you're assuming in both observable and unobservable differences, they're going to be quite similar. So you can compare then the impact of tutoring just for those pupils close to the threshold. So it's good for that, but it's not so great if you're wanting to compare pupils who only got 20 out of 100 compared to those who got 80 out of 100 because they're too far the side of the threshold. So that's when a regression discontinuity design is useful. So only a couple more slides to go before our Q&A, but just wanted to highlight conducting quasi-experimental design can be achieved when you've got that comparison group data available. So if you're a member of any of the national trackers, so HEAT, MREP or AIM Higher, you can track attainment data for your pupils that have participated in interventions. So I know from HEAT, for example, from attending a webinar yesterday on their sort of Key Stage 4 attainment database, they track Key Stage 4 data for your students from the National Pupil Database, and then they can facilitate in the creation of a comparison group for you. So that's comparing to students that didn't take part in your intervention, comparing against your school average or your local authority average, and also using prior attainment as well. So you can track what they got in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, for example, as well. That's the main one to use for attainment, but also just to flag if you're looking not only at attainment, but enrolment into higher education or tracking them into HE, then UCAS can provide a comparison group as well. So comparing your potential applicants with a national average, a constructed control group, and also your competition, so any sort of institutions, universities in the same area as you, and they can look at application to acceptance rates. And GIST can also support using HESA dataset, so the Higher Education Statistics Agency. So again, that enrolment data, so they can compare to a matched comparison group. So they'll match your students with students with very similar characteristics in things like prior attainment, gender, other demographics as well. So this is really useful to sort of going from that type 2 to type 3 evidence. And finally, I just wanted to flag some resources. I appreciate have covered a lot today, and there's lots of different methodologies we've gone through. So it's just a flag, as I mentioned, we've got that pre-post testing resources. So it actually breaks down how to conduct a paired t-test, so on pre and post data using Excel. So I'd recommend having a look at that. We've also delivered webinars in the past, so on correlation versus causation, so type 2 versus type 3 evidence. Webinars on randomized controlled trials, so it goes into a lot more detail on sort of individual versus group level randomization, and also the different quasi-experimental designs methods. We've also got a lot of project reports that use these various methodologies. So for example, our summer school project uses a randomized control trial. So that could be good to look at if you want to see how we've used this methodology. We've also done something on reforming the curriculum and the impact on the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So that's using a quasi-experimental design. So I'd recommend looking at that as well. And we've also really recently published a lot of reports on evaluation with small cohorts and the type of evaluation methodology you can use with small groups of students. So that's good to look at as well if you're dealing with small groups. But we will, of course, signpost all of these and link to all of these in our follow-up email afterwards.